Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. My name is Eliane Schmid, and I will be hosting today's conversation on Mahāyāna Buddhism. Joining me for this Wisdom Talk is Michael von Brück. Von Brück was professor of religious studies and the director of the interdisciplinary program in religious studies at Ludwig Maximilians University, Munich, until 2014. He has a background in evangelical theology, Sanskrit, and Indian philosophy, with teaching experience in India and training as a Zen and yoga instructor in both India and Japan. With a global presence through guest professorships, he is renowned for his extensive publications on Buddhism, Hinduism, and intercultural dialogue, emphasizing the fusion of science, art, and spirituality as a foundation for lifestyle transformation. Michael von Brück, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Mrs. Schmidt.
Michael Hampe is also in the studio with us. He's the initiator of Metis and professor for philosophy. Thank you very much for also joining us.
Thank you.
To begin with, I would like to ask you, Mr. von Brück, if you could briefly explain to us and our listeners what Mahāyāna Buddhism is. I realize this is not something that can be subsumed in a few sentences, but maybe just as a starting point, could you also explain in what way Mahāyāna Buddhism differs from the many other strands of Buddhism?
Yes. Mahāyāna means great vehicle. And of course, that makes sense only if you have a small vehicle. And Buddhism developed probably in the 3rd or 4th century BC, developed in different sociological environments. First, of course, we have the monks or the Buddha founding a monastic order. But there were also lay people supporting the monks, of course. And this is not different in other situations in ancient India. So we have a movement which consists of, we can say, religious specialists and lay people supporting the religious specialists, having respectively each group their own practices. In the course of time, and this is the general perception today, we say Mahāyāna developed out of these lay movements and involvement of greater portions of the society with kind of number of different practices, not as strictly prescribed by a rule as in the case of the monks, and later also some nuns. But we have reason to assume that this lay movement and this Mahāyāna Buddhism and Mahāyāna practices and Mahāyāna philosophy started very early. This is due to historical circumstances, due to findings of texts and so on. But later, and now I come to the point, the situation had developed in such a way that the Mahāyānins looked down on the other schools, which were more strictly monastic, and called them the small vehicle with a kind of derogative meaning. This is Hinayana. This is not a term, of course, they use themselves. What we have there are 18 classical schools of Buddhism, and the Theravadins are just one of these schools, which was very prominent and which is the only one surviving from this time. So what we have today is Theravada, and Theravada, that means literally the way of the elders. That was what the type of Buddhism we have in Sri Lanka or Southeast Asia, except Vietnam. And the Mahāyāna, which is the type of Buddhism we have in the beginning in North India, but then also, going to China and extending to Tibet and via China to Korea, Japan, and also Vietnam.
So you have a small vehicle and a big vehicle here. And now I'm curious to know more, what does this big vehicle mean, actually? So what does this encompass? And are there any specific texts that we need to talk about when we think about this big vehicle? And how does that influence maybe the small one?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Let's start with the texts. The texts of the early schools are in Pali. This is a Middle Indian language, and derived or close to Sanskrit, but different from it. The texts in Mahāyāna, most of them are in Sanskrit. And this is due to historical circumstances, the destruction of Buddhism in India in later times, that most of these texts are lost, or many are lost, but preserved in translations, Chinese, Tibetan translations, most of all. So this is the different textual basis. But the texts themselves are very different. I refer now only to the so-called sutras. Sutra actually means thread. So it's like pearls, as it were, on a thread, on a necklace or so. The different words of the Buddha are designed to be on a thread. So that's sutra. But the Pali Sutras, which are common to all Buddhists, by the way, but the Mahāyāna Sutras are additional, only for the Mahāyānas. The Pali Sutras are believed to be spoken by the living circumstances of the early Buddhists, and the Buddha is reported there to answer questions of people coming to him and relating, to the rule of the monks, to the behavior, to the meditation practices of the monks, but also, of course, to philosophical, or we could better say, perhaps existential questions of the people. The Mahāyāna Sutras are very different. They are not preached by the historical Buddha only, Gautama walking there in northern India and giving his talks. But they are believed to be transmitted by, we could say, the celestial Buddha, or the Buddha in his superhuman glory. When we look at one of the most prominent sutras, I think we will talk about it later, the Lotus Sutra, there are hundreds of monks gathered there, and there are maybe even thousands. There are celestial beings, angels and whatnot all. There are bodhisattvas coming down from heaven. So it's an imaginary sphere. It's not the historical Buddha teaching, here and time and space, but a kind of imaginary, superhuman Buddha, transcendent in some ways, teaching the eternal truth. And this is very different, of course, and the language is different, and the content is different. Mahāyāna means great vehicle, not only in terms of greatness, it's glorious also, but it encompasses different cultures, different expectations, different languages, different types of reasoning, different types of meditation. So in this way, it's a very inclusive development. Whereas the earlier traditions, such as Theravada or the Sarvastivadins or the Sautrantikas and so the different schools, they would stick to their specific teaching, directly believed to be taken or to be given by the historical Buddha at during his lifetime.
I have a question about the term vehicle. Sometimes you hear in the West that this is a metaphor that was used in order to describe what happens when you meditate, for example, that the Buddha said, what I tell you or what you do when you meditate is using a raft that crosses a river. Now you are on this side of the river, the world as you experience it, and now you take the vehicle crossing the river in order to reach, for example, Nirvāna. And sometimes there's made a difference between the Christian religion and Buddhism by saying in Christianity you have to be saved by Jesus, whereas in Buddhism you have to save yourself by taking the vehicle. Is that a right description? And what is the vehicle? Is the vehicle the meditation practice? Is it reading the sutras? Is it listening to a master?
Well, the situation is very different when we come to Buddhism. And the question is not properly phrased this way, because when you say, and this is what Christians usually, what you just tell to the Buddhists, you have to save yourself. We are saved by the other power. The Buddhists don't believe in a self. Who is saving whom if you don't believe in a self? And this is a very important question, and this is very practical to the Buddhist meditation process. We come to that later. First, let me say something to the term yana, vehicle. Indeed, it's a raft originally, bringing you from one shore to the other shore of a river. And this is used in many Indian different contexts, not only in Buddhism. So you have this in the Upanishads, for instance, crossing from this life limited by time and space and
suffering,
and so on, crossing to the further shore, as the Upanishads would call it, even pre-Buddhist Upanishads would call it this way, means using a raft, using a spiritual practice, using also thinking and the right insight, which is part of a spiritual practice, to cross to the other side, which is free of suffering, which is eternal, which is liberation. The Indian term for that usually is mukti or moksha, liberation. And so you use this vehicle to cross to the other side of the river. And of course, we have similar ideas in other cultures as well, for instance, the ancient Greek culture and so on. But the question is, do you have to do it yourself, or are you granted liberation by some kind of transcendent God?
By grace, for example?
Well, grace, of course, is a very interesting concept, because grace is much misunderstood in the Christian tradition. Let me go to this just for a moment. Of course, it's a grace to be in meditation and to experience in meditation your real nature. Is it your own grace? Is it your own power, or is it a different power? You see, the interesting term here is that grace, English, or Gnade in Deutsch or so, are translations of Latin gratia. And this is very strange, because it comes from a juridical context in the Roman Empire.
Something is granted to you.
The emperor gives you either, release, or he condemns you, and so on. And the reason is that the first translators, or the first translator who actually was so influential, translated from the Greek to the Latin, was Tertullian around 200 AD. And he was a lawyer and used this language. And the whole Western type of Christianity, this is the Roman Christianity as well, the Reformed Christianity, depends on this understanding. But grace originally in Greek is different. It's an artistic term. It's coming from the theater. It's coming from the arts. It is the graces, the dance, the music, and
graceful movements, for example.
Graceful movements. This is what we sometimes could nicely translate a gracefulness in English, or in German it's Anmut. Actually, it's a very much a term from the arts. It's beauty. It is something which inspires you. It's a kind of, I would say, liberating and freeing you to a graceful movement like this. So this is different. It's making a change within you. And this is precisely what the Buddhists experience when they meditate. For instance, early Buddhists, when they do mindfulness meditation, you become aware of the present moment. You become aware of the rhythm of your breath. You become aware of an aesthetic quality of your life, of your body, of the beauty, of the, I would say, the floating experience of your body movements, and so on and so on. And it is something which happens to you when you give up your immediate intention to reach or to achieve something, we have this wonderful saying in English, when you let it happen, when you let it go.
Now, you have both given me a lot of metaphors. There was talk of raft, of beads on a thread, of dance, of being lifted up, being in the air, and so forth. And you talked about Buddhists in general and meditation just now, but I am curious to know who was actually meant to engage in Mahāyāna Buddhism. Was this meant just for the monks in the beginning, or was this a broad movement that was meant for any kind of person to engage in?
That's a very good question, an important thing. When we look at Buddhism, we look at it in the West usually through the eyes or through the lens of the 19th century first translators and so on. And they saw in Buddhism a rational philosophy, or better maybe a rational psychology, the psychology of perception and so on. We can come to that later. It is very rational. It is very interesting. But that's not all of Buddhism. When these people who just studied these texts, the Pali texts, came to China or to Japan and visited Buddhist countries, they encountered a totally different type of Buddhism, with rituals, with prayers, with people going, to the stupas and bring offerings, and so on and so on. So from the very beginning of the Buddhist movement, we have more or less two practices two sides. We have the monks studying and engaging in meditation, and we have the lay people who also study something and engage in meditation, but they also venerate and worship the relics of the Buddha. You see, the relics of the Buddha after he had died and after he had been cremated, the ashes and some bones and what was left there, the relics were gathered and were enshrined in so-called stupas. Later in China and East Asia, this became the pagodas. And they became places of pilgrimage and of worship. So the whole religious cult, which you have in other traditions as well, in the Indian religious context, but in other religions as well. So the whole cult developed about the relics. They wanted to worship this wonderful Buddha who had taught such a wonderful teaching, how to get out of the samsara, of the circle of existence. And so they venerated him, they worshipped it. And of course, what did they do in these stupas? They told stories. They told the life stories of the Buddha, which were, collected sayings, and they became together. Much later, they were compiled, the Lalita Vistara, for instance, they were compiled in a kind of life story book, but that was much later. They told these stories of the Buddha's life, of this famous, 4 stages. First meeting a sick person, or first being grown up in a very rich family and having all the wealth and so on, and then questioning because of the sickness he encountered in life and because of the old age and the death he encountered. And when he decided, I will withdraw and will find out the truth about life beyond all these kind of superficial things, because everybody has to die and everybody's finally in suffering. So all these stories were told, and they were not only told about the present Buddha, because the belief of the Indians is in reincarnation. So the present Buddha had different lives before he became this Buddha of this time. And these stories, which were told about his former lives, the so-called Jatakas, they were also told at the stupas to the people visiting there. So out of all these different practices and storytelling and so on, which was to admonish the people, came out the whole Mahāyāna literature and the whole Mahāyāna sentiment.
Sometimes in the West there's made the difference between magic and wisdom, that there are people who believe in the magic power of objects or relics, and there are people who stick to intellectual insights, say. And in Christianity you have relics also. You might have a tomb of a saint, and people are going to this tomb and touch the tomb in order to be healed from a disease, say. And some people look down at such practices and say that's just magic, that's not really wisdom. What role do the relics in Buddhism play? Do they have magical power? Do the people believe that they can be cured from a disease by visiting a stupa or so?
That depends on the people. Of course, it plays a great role. The philosophers or the critical rationalists among the Buddhists would say, well, the power is not in the relic, but in your belief in the relic. So if you believe and if you have a strong concentration on that, it is this concentration and this mental condition which will help you to overcome physical or mental disease and so on. But this is the minority. I mean, these are the perhaps some of the educated critical rationalists, I would call them. But the majority of the people in Buddhist countries, wherever you go, believes in the radiation of the relics. And if you don't have relics, what you can enshrine also is, for instance, piece of paper where a sutra, a very important sutra, for instance, a Heart Sutra, is written. Copying the Heart Sutra brings you good merit. So you copy that and is somehow consecrated and so on. And then this is enshrined in the stupa and will also have this magic power. Mm-hmm.
You just mentioned now the Heart Sutra, and I would like to dig deeper into these fundamental texts that you mentioned before, also the Heart Sutra and the Lotus Sutra. Could you maybe explain a bit what those two texts are and what their meanings are?
Let me start with the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is probably one of the most well-known texts, especially in East Asia. Some scholars have called it the Bible of East Asia. So that means China and Japan and so on. So a lot of different types of Buddhism are built upon the Lotus Sutra. What is this? It is one of these teachings I mentioned before, where the Buddha, in his, I would say, celestial glory, appears and teaches the Lotus Sutra now to this present age. Interesting is that the text itself says he has preached the Lotus Sutra many times before in other world periods, as it were, where he had appeared as a Buddha as well. So it is some transcendent time and space transcendent setting. We are pretty sure, or scholars today assume, that the Lotus Sutra must have been compiled around 100 AD, or maybe even a few decades earlier, so around the same time as Jesus had lived in Palestine. So that is interesting. It's about the same time. Buddhism had already existed for some time, and as we have seen, had existed in different schools, referring to different texts, so different sutras as the most important one to them. And so, in other words, it was divided into certain confessions. And the Lotus Sutra comes in and says, well, there is only one Buddha, and there's only one confession. There's only one yana, not Mahāyāna or Hinayana and so on, but Ekayana. Eka means one. This is the first thing. So that shows us there was some dispute before who is the right Buddhist and who is really on top of Buddhist teachings, who has it. And the Lotus Sutra says here it comes everything together.
So it's an economic.
It's an ecumenical attempt. Ecumenical attempt, as it were. The second point is that the Lotus Sutra teaches, and this is one of the reasons why it's so popular, that everybody can attain Buddhahood. Not only monks who have studied a long time, and probably not only one lifetime, but many lifetimes, and have finally achieved this mental state of arhathood. Arhat means noble and high intellectual as well as emotional and so achievement in terms of the Buddhist ideals. But that everybody, even lay people, can attain Buddhahood if they practice properly. What the practice is, I will tell you in a minute. Well, this is a problem with women, even in the Lotus Sutra. There is one lady, she is not even fully human, she is a Naga, so that means from the human realm, a little bit different between human and superhuman and animal. Anyway, she is a Naga queen, and she wants to attain Buddhahood, and she will attain it, but she first had to be transformed into a man. So this is why they even there in this ecumenical
sexism even there.
Sexism even there. So this is of course there in the tradition, but otherwise everybody can attain Buddhahood. And the third point is, and this is maybe the most important new or the important center of the Lotus Sutra, that the Buddha teaches all kinds of different methods to attain Nirvāna or to attain a higher reincarnation and so on, to attain the Buddhist goal. He teaches all kinds of different practices, and they are called upaya, or Japanese hoben. That means skillful means. So all different types of reasoning, all different types of imagination, all different types of meditation, spiritual practices, that means physical and psychosomatic practices to tame your mind, are accepted or are not only admitted, but even cherished. For instance, recitation of texts, or recitation even only of the title of the Lotus Sutra. In Japanese, we have this now, the whole movements, just chanting the title of the Lotus Sutra, Nam, Myoho, Renge, Kyo, and so on. This is in the sutra, and this is enough for your, we would say, salvation, or for your attainment of Buddhahood, if you do it one-pointedly, with the proper mind, with total surrender of all your mental faculties, intellectual as well as emotional, and so on. So, of course, in such a teaching can accommodate many different traditions, many different practices.
So it's focusing your mind, the main point.
Focusing your mind, and whatever means you have. You have a mantra, you have an image, You have the breath, you have social practice, which is very important, this is a very important point. There's a whole chapter 25, on Avalokiteshvara. We'll come to that later. That is the practice of wisdom in action. So the Lotus Sutra has been so popular because it's so encompassing. And of course, the lotus, maybe I should explain this. The lotus, Saddharma Pundarika, Mahāyāna Sutra is the full title. The lotus is taken as a symbol or an image because of several specific traits of the lotus flower. The lotus flower grows not in clear water, but in dumpy water, even smelly sometimes, it's mud. And out of this mud comes the beautiful lotus flower, about 1 meter or so above the water. And there comes this full, wonderful flower. So this is a symbol to the East Asians that in the mud of our human existence, physical stuff, the sicknesses and the uncertainties we have, and of course death and dying and violence and our mixed up emotions and everything. Out of all that grows the most beautiful flower. And the second thing is the lotus flower, but also the leaves, they are very big. The leaves cannot be stained by water. So they have a kind of wax or so on it.
They're pure in a sense.
They are pure. Nothing can defile the beauty of this flower and also the leaf. And this is symbol to the East Asians to say, well, the human mind or the deepest layers of the human mind are somewhat like the lotus flower. It's pure in nature, and when you discover it, you are free.
So you just talked about the Lotus Sutra being a very encompassing text, and before we talked about the role of women slightly. So I have actually 2 questions, and the first question would be that speaking of a lotus, a flower, is often something attributed to something more feminine. So I wanted to ask what specifically the role of women would be here, and if they were integrated in the text and were also meant to read the text. And the other question that I have is, can you speak of the sutras as a religious text in a way, or is that something that you would not call religion at all?
Oh, yes. You see, Buddhism has different aspects. Buddhism is certainly a philosophy in terms of asking the questions, what is cognition, what is perception, how do cognition and emotion relate, and so on and so on. And of course, also talking about the relationship between what is material or perceived to be matter or mind and so on. Buddhism is also a psychology because it teaches, it's a basic teaching, how to integrate contradicting emotions, how to integrate contradicting or at least differing perceptual aspects of our perception and processing of perception. And Buddhism is also a religion in terms of venerating, worshipping, focusing your mind on something which is not day-to-day experience in life, but something taken out, something transcendental. Now, for instance, the sutra, as you asked, Even in the early Buddhist tradition, the Theravada sutras, they are not venerated or worshipped in terms of the script or the books which are there, the palm leaves or so. But they are recited, sometimes memorized. For instance, when we have big celebrations, Buddha's teaching 2,500 years, a couple of years ago and so on, then the whole Pali canon will be recited in the different languages, in Pali, but also in Burmese and so on, in Sinhalese. So there is a great veneration for the text, not in the written form, but in the oral form. But in Mahāyāna, we also have this veneration for the text in the written form. As I said, it is considered to be beneficial if you copy the text. It's one of the religious practices of lay people until today, even in Japan today. And when visitors or pilgrims visit a temple, they will be given a sheet of paper and they can copy, for instance, the Heart Sutra or parts of the Lotus Sutra or just the title of the Lotus Sutra and so on. And if these texts are consecrated in a stupa, then they have even this special power, this healing power.
But in the Mosaic tradition, you have this possibility of a text being given to a human being by God. The 10 Commandments have been given to Moses by God. The Quran has been given to Muhammad by God. And does this transcendental situation which you described, that the Buddha in heaven is preaching the same situation, that a goddess is giving his wisdom to humans, or would you say, no, it's more a fictitious setup that's not to be compared with the Quran or with the 10 Commandments?
Oh, it can be compared, of course, but it's different. It's not the same. In order to answer this question, I need to draw our attention to this idea of the three kaya, the three bodies of the Buddha, which we have in Mahāyāna only, coming maybe 5th, 6th century or so. This is very similar to the Christian Trinity, and many, many comparisons have been made. There is the Buddha as he lived here in North India and walked and had a physical body and a body which would decay, which would die, and so on and so on. This is called the Rupakaya, or the form body, or Nirvāna. Then what the Buddha taught is the Dharma. The Dharma is that which sustains the world. It is the universal law of the world, which, as it were, is the structure of everything. This is the Dharma. So what he preaches, or what he incorporates, or represents, or embodies, is this Dharmakaya. This is the highest, the transcendental body. You could call it a god, but it's not God in terms of a personal will. It's the structure of the universe. It's the truth of the universe in that sense. And certainly not a creator, because there's no creation in Buddhism. But then you see, you have something in between, what they call the Sambhogakaya. Literally meaning is the enjoyment body. This is the visionary body. This is what the fiction is, but the fiction is very real. I mean, this is what drives the world. It is not only fiction, but it is the images, it's the power, it's the energies in the realm which they call the subtle reality, or the subtle body. It's something in between what we call the gross physical body and the mental energies. So it's something in between. What we usually consider to be, something like inspiration. What is inspiration? What is the spirit? This is this realm, and this is what is the body, or the sphere, or the realm out of which the Buddha preaches the Mahāyāna Sutras.
So it's a little bit more complicated than God just telling Muhammad or Moses something.
Yeah, no. But this kind of objectification of God is totally rejected by Buddhism, because it's a human projection, nothing else.
But can you attend to the other question as well? Do women have the same access to the text? Can they handle the text in the same way as men? Or is there something similar to what you have in Mosaic traditions, that there is a male person who reads the holy text, and women are allowed to listen to the text but not allowed to read it out to the Gemeinde, to the Sangha?
Yeah. Well, Buddhism is part of the human heritage of the last 3,000-4,000 years and so on. Then this is patriarchal and this is male-dominated, certainly. But first of all, one has to say the Buddha also allowed, the records say after some hesitation, also a female order, which is something which is a step forward at this time. And later in history, we have, especially in the Chinese tradition, and we have female orders of monks. We have highly respected, spiritually, realized persons, which are female in the Tibetan tradition, but also in the Chinese tradition. We have a tendency to integrate femaleness, let's say, like this, but always a little bit under the tutelage or under the second coming after the men. One interesting feature is that Avalokiteshvara, the one who is mentioned as a bodhisattva, the most important bodhisattva in Buddhism, by the way, mentioned in the Heart Sutra, he is a male in India and becomes female.
On some pictures, he looks like Mary with a child, and he's even pictured with a child, isn't he?
He becomes female, more or less, or at least androgynous in China, in the Song dynasty, and later in Japan as Guan Yin or Kannon. And this is interesting. Though there seems to be a sentiment or a movement in Mahāyāna Buddhism where femaleness is accepted as a genuine expression of the Buddha qualities.
This is very interesting. So there seems to be several instances of a certain fluidity concerning gender, as you said that there was.
Exactly. And of course, today, we have a strong movement for a full participation of women, a full ordination of women in the Tibetan tradition, for instance. And Dalai Lama is trying to cherish this and bring it forward. And there are, of course, many practitioners in America and in Europe especially who want to come forward, and there is a change, but it takes time, of course, and there's resistance against it. But anyway, all sentient beings have the capability for Buddhahood, some more or less, depending on the quality of the mind. And certainly today there is a tendency for a full integration of the, let me put it this way, femaleness.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you also just mentioned the influence of Buddhism in not only East Asia, but in America, in Europe, for example. And so I wanted to ask, because you also mentioned these two terms before, Samsāra and Nirvāna. And these two fundamental ideas have also entered, I would say, Western languages. And Samsāra, as you said, is the cycle of birth, of becoming and passing away, the cycle of suffering, and Nirvāna, the exit from this that is actually strived for. So I wanted to ask, is this a sort of two-world doctrine, or do the two make one unity? And how come we suddenly have all these terms in our Western language as well?
Well, the Buddhists basically see two different states of mind. The mind of suffering, which is samsara, of everything is suffering, sarvam dukkam, that's the first word of the Buddha, and how to get out of it, how to blow out these sufferings, that is nirvana. Nirvana, literally translated, means blowing out. But what is this, Is suffering really the appropriate translation for dukkha? And I doubt it.
Burden is sometimes said.
Sometimes burden. I usually translate frustration. What is that frustration? That frustration is that human beings, for certain reasons, maybe we still have the time, maybe not, to discern, human beings want eternity or want stability, want things to be as they are, want identity, want an ego which is identical, which I am. And this is an illusion to Buddhists. This is a fundamental illusion. In order to keep up this illusion, I try to grasp, and I try to, tanna or trishna is the Buddhist original term, I try to fill myself with material or mental or whatever stuff which gives me the illusion of stability. But everything is change, and so the reality, it does not meet this expectation of humans, and this is why they are frustrated. In order to overcome this frustration, they try to grasp, and grasping is getting everything I can get. Since everybody does this, they are contradicting with other human beings or other sentient beings, competing, as it were, in grasping, and this is why humans develop hatred. So greed and hatred are interrelated, and they are both poisoning the mind because of this basic ignorance about the status of my own being. To overcome this basic ignorance, it means also to overcome the need, as it were, for greed and for hatred if this greed is frustrated. So to overcome this ignorance is to overcome samsara and finally prepare the way to nirvana. So it's a state of mind of knowledge, but knowledge not only in a cognitive sense, but in an existential, deep existential sense.
But don't you get into a sort of paradox, which I sometimes see in the Heart Sutra, that striving for stability is seen to be different from striving to nirvana or nibbana. But both are types of striving. And sometimes it looks to me, at least in translations, you know that better, that the Heart Sutra says there is no point in striving, there is no striving, there is no path. Stop striving. So you strive for not striving, in a sense, and don't you get into a riddle there, into a paradox?
Yeah. Now the Heart Sutra, of course, is very difficult to understand because so short, is trying to put everything in a nutshell, and especially also to provoke your thinking in the way you just express it. Let me go one step back to describe it in such a way. There are two types of striving. Perhaps we have the same English term now, but they are totally different. There is striving to get something, ego-centered, to, as it were, attract things, persons, material goods, mental goods, fame, and everything. This is, as it were, striving to aggrandize my ego.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, which I could not or should not translate with desire, but is the longing to surrender myself to the interconnectedness of all reality. There is an intentionality, that's right. There's an intention, but it's not striving in a sense of getting things or aggrandizing my ego. So it's rather just the opposite. It's the intention to surrender all my mental, psychic, psychological faculties, my intention to be part or to be connected in the web of reality. Because the basic Buddhist idea, which is also, of course, behind in these paradoxical sayings in the Heart Sutra, is reality is not substances, individual things, atoms or quarks or beings being there and being created or being there and then entering into a relationship, building up reality. But it's just the opposite. The basic Buddhist idea is the very fundamental reality is a net, a virtual net, we could say, of interrelationships. And out of this interrelational structure comes something which we call reality, physical reality. And they call it, this is not permanent, they call it arisings. So even the smallest particles or pre-particle energetic, shall I say, happenings or arisings come out of nothing, are there for a very, very short time, and then intermingle with others and display what reality is.
I think it was wasn't it the Zen master Uchiyama, the Japanese Zen master, who once used the metaphor for the intention you just described as opening the hand of thought, which is more or less the opposite movement than grasping, that first you grasp something and then you let go and open your hand.
This is one way to put it. Usually I use a very simple simile or analogy for my students, my Zen students actually, because this is a setting where they practice and which is easier to talk than just in the academic language and on the academic table. You see, when we walk, now we have fall, we walk through the forest and we see little mushrooms. Now, one mushroom is very young, the other one is old, one is a little bit eaten up already by some deer, and the other one is a little bit rotten, and so on. So they are different mushrooms. But everybody who knows, who is a mycologist, as it were, knows that the mushroom is not the fruit bodies up there, but the mushroom is the net, the mycelium.
In the ground.
Which is an interconnected web. So coming from samsara to nirvana, as it were, is coming from surface to the ground, is coming from this perception of reality as different entities and then having this and that history, coming to the realization that in reality, everything is an interconnected net. All different physical or all different aspects of realities which we describe in physical terms with space and time extension and so on, with causality, but also all different happenings which are mental events, as it were, representing these causalities and these interrelationships. So when you come to the understanding of the fundamental interrelatedness of all things, you realize that your view that this is this and this is that and this has an identity and this has an identity and most of all my ego has an identity. If you realize that this is not the case, then we talk about, in Buddhism, we talk about this is empty, shunya. And this is the whole concept of emptiness or the realization of emptiness. It is nothing else than the realization of interrelationships. There is no independent entity whatsoever, but relation or interrelatedness is the fundamental reality. And this frees you, as it were, this frees you for compassion, for a totally different attitude towards yourself and towards the world around you.
Now, Mr. Humpe, you have several times tried to make parallels or understand the differences between Buddhism and Christianity. And I also thought about previous wisdom talks where we noticed that maybe Western society has a stronger focus on the individual and individual striving and so forth. Whereas now, again, we have very much the idea of having an interrelational concept of something that connects and that is not about just the single self, but something bigger and something in a community. And so I wanted to ask you, Mr. von Brück, if you could maybe just go in a little bit deeper on what the individual's role is, in a sense, and if that person has an individual role, or if also this theory is very much something that we should engage in a communal thinking.
First of all, what Buddhism is concerned, and then with a look on Christianity, okay? Now, in Buddhism, of course, on a certain level, you need engagement, you need intention, you need to study, you need a sense of, I do this, certainly. And this is what they call the conventional level, the samvritti satya. But then this is the aspect, as it were, from our ordinary consciousness and from our ordinary way of thinking, the mood we are right now. But if you go into a deeper state of consciousness, such as meditative states, which are many different ones, you will realize that this ego is not there. There is no ego. There is a flux or a flow of energies, of different aspects of mental energies you can become aware of. But when you ask what is the subject of all this, you just go back and back and back and realize, no, there's just these streams of consciousness and intermingling with each other. There is no ego. This is a deeper realization. Now, out of this comes, of course, the wisdom. There is no ego, there's interconnectedness. This wisdom, prajna in Sanskrit, immediately is expressed, I would say, in what they call karuna, active engagement for the benefit or for the well-being of all sentient beings. So karuna, or this active engagement for the well-being of all sentient beings, is not an additional virtue or ethics or so, but is flowing out automatically from this wisdom experience which I just have been trying to describe. So there is no ego engaging with another ego or I engaging with another I, but it is a realization that I-thou is just a relationship which stabilizes each other. Or in other ways, when I actively engage in healing, for instance, another person, I heal not another person actually, but myself. So because myself and the other person are not totally differentiated. So now looking at Christianity, you see, well, this is not so easy. Of course, in the Western world, we have developed a strong sense of ego and of a separated ego from others, which then, of course, in our ethical discourses and so come together in intersubjectivity and so on. But in the whole stream of mystical traditions, which is coming, of course, from pre-Christian times or from Neoplatonic thinking and experience, I think, you have a different view. And I don't want to go into the details, but just to raise one issue here. Now, when Jesus, for instance, says, according to John's Gospel, I mean, we don't know much about Jesus, what he says, but in John's Gospel is reported be saying, me and the Father are one. Who is saying this sentence? Or in Paul, I mean, this is a historical figure, and we know that his letters are his own handwriting. Now, for instance, a famous letter which he writes to his friends, his group, the community there in Galatia, in chapter 2, he says, well, I'm so deeply, in a sense, fulfilled by the sense of Christ. It's not anymore me talking, but Christ in me. Who is telling this sentence? That's what the Zen masters ask the Christians usually when we study Zen. Who is saying this? So, and then you have the whole bunch of mystics, starting from the Cappadocian theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, and so on, and then through the Dionysius Areopagita, through the whole Christian history, coming to this is not the ego, this is the spirit, or Jesus, or God's spirit, or whatever. Then we have the Trinitarian language, of course, fulfilling me completely. You have this in the Carmelite mystics, and you have it, for instance, already in the 13th century in Master Eckhart, then his disciples, Suso and Tauler, from Suso and Tauler coming to Luther, even there are many statements in this way. It's not anymore me talking, but the spirit within me. That's a strong tradition in Christianity, but sometimes we have forgotten it or put it aside. But I think it's maybe the center of Christianity.
So are you saying that in both in Buddhism and in Christian mysticism, the distinction between a cognition and an emotion, between the cognition of seeing the interconnectedness of all beings and having the emotion of compassion are blurred, are more or less the same? Or is the emotion flowing from the cognition, or the cognition flowing from the emotion, that you feel compassion, and by feeling compassion you see that the other being is not that different from you, that you are connected?
Yeah, I think it's closer in Buddhism. And it's because the cognition is really stressed. But cognition is not just making a concept of it. This is exactly what the Heart Sutra rejects, This, it tries to destroy any conceptualization. It is a deep realization, a mental experience, sure. What else is an experience where you realize this oneness I would say, in a psychosomatic breakthrough. And this is so fundamental to the Buddhists, and this is what the Buddhists say, and this is different from Christianity. This is Christianity. This is not just, say, a gift to some elected people, the mystics or the chosen ones by God or so.
So everybody can experience it.
This is for everybody. This is the potential of every human being. And in fact, it is a fulfillment of human being. Human beings are here on earth in order to learn that and to practice it. This is the Buddhist emphasis, and I think this is so important to today's world. And this is what our forefathers, in the 19th century and 20th century had seen. They say with our individualism and individual, or the focus or emphasis on individual attainments, whatever it is in the West, we finally destroy ourselves because we overstretch in many ways. So Schopenhauer, for instance, criticizes Kant because Schopenhauer's ethics is so much informed by Buddhist sentiment, or Buddhist and Upanishads, Indian feelings in general. And his ethics is grounded in the experience that the other is not really other. Whereas for Kant, it's a duty, to bridge the gap, as it were. And Schopenhauer says that doesn't work. So, and Schopenhauer, of course, was a very great source of inspiration, for instance, for Nietzsche and Wagner. And Wagner, for instance, in his famous, Parsifal and so on, in his what we call Mitleids ethics, the ethics of compassion, is building on that. So in his famous opera, Tristan and Isolde, he lets some say there is not anymore Tristan and Isolde, but the word "and" is strong and is strange, but the love needs to be so deep. It's not just an emotional coming of two together, but love is the realization of a basic oneness. And this is, of course, Isolde's transformation at the end of this opera, and he puts it, I think, very deeply and beautifully into music. But this is inspired by the Buddhist basic idea. It is not an additional ethical move or obligation or duty or whatsoever, but it is a realization of reality as it really is.
Now, you talked a bit before that about how Buddhism is practiced today, and with Kant and Schopenhauer, we've become a bit closer to our time, and so now I'm making the final push to nowadays, and also because I see that time is running out slowly again, I wanted to ask a bit more about practice. So you also said how you try to teach Buddhism or Buddhist teachings to your students. And I heard that you recently went to Japan. And so this, for me, is like the ultimate practice. So what did you do in Japan? Maybe as a final question, why did you go to Japan? And how would you say Buddhism in that sense is practiced today?
Well, you see, the interesting thing in my biography, since you're asking, is I studied Hindu culture, Sanskrit, and the Upanishads, and so on, and not Buddhism at all. But then came to us a very famous a Jesuit who had practiced Zen in Japan, Enomiya Lassalle. He is a great figure bringing Zen to Europe and later on also to America. And we just practiced sitting, breathing, Zen meditation. And this was so important to me. I was a student at this time, intellectually engaged, and learning languages and history and all these things. So this was a different dimension which touched me in the depths of my heart but also in the depths of my heart as a person who had been growing up in music. And so I had this very, very close relation between the experience which I experienced there in Zen, and this stillness and silence, and what's happening in music. So, and then I went to Japan in the 1970s and became a student there in one of the Rinzai monasteries in Kyoto, in Tenryuji, and studied Zen. And for many years I'm engaged in that and try to give it to my students today. What is it? It is a psychophysical exploration of potentialities which are there in the mind, except our ordinary states of waking, was what we are talking now in conceptualizations and so on, different also from dream states, different from what happens to us in dreams, obviously different from that was in deep sleep, or that was deep sleep, but there are different modes of the mind which you can cultivate in meditation. Sometimes, these states happen spontaneously. For instance, in a deep emotional, very deep emotional situation, either great love or great loss and great pain, or in a deep experience of beauty in nature, or in music, or in dancing. Today, also, by the way, in sports, when you have a complete exhaustion, I've talked to sports people who had a great achievement there, and when they are totally one-pointed and totally exhausted, they reach a state of mind which is obviously very similar to that which we experience in Zen through meditation. So it is potentialities of the mind which are being discovered there, which make people, I would say, develop their potentials in a much more beautiful and comprehensive way than it is usually the case. And now comes the important thing, and makes them realize that life is one. And this, of course, I think automatically induces a different attitude towards ourselves and toward other sentient beings, toward other human beings. And so the joy of life is in realizing this and actualizing this relationship which you experience there on the cushion in meditation. It is not a burden to be interconnected, but it is the great joy of life. I think this is the focus of meditation. And I think this is what we need so much today. And this is why these Buddhist practices, or these practices which they are human practices, this is because we have these human potentials, but in Buddhism, they are cultivated in a very specific and very, I think, sober and very clear and systematic way. So that's why we are extremely happy and we are can be extremely grateful that we receive these techniques and these teachings to develop our potentials, which is so much needed in today's world. Obviously, we have been able to develop technology, science and technology, and to manipulate the outside world to such an extent that we can even destroy ourselves with these technologies. So we have to develop our mental, our inner world as well, in order to balance out, these capabilities we have in the outside world. But we have not yet learned, for instance, to control our emotions, as you can see when you look in the newspapers. And sometimes also when you look in the mirror, you also realize you have not yet controlled. And this is what is the joy. So you become artist of your own self-realization.
Artist of your own self-realization and appreciation for life, a joy in life. I think that's what we, as you said, all need. And this makes you hopeful, I think, at least that there's a way to at least make your own life better. And I think I would like to take these words as ending words for this wisdom talk. And thank you both, Mr. Hampe and Mr. von Brück, for being with me today.
Thank you for your question and for your presence.
Thank you.
At this point, I would also like to invite our listeners to follow further wisdom talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, www.metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. If you would like to share your own wisdom thoughts on the Metis portal, we encourage you to do so. We have an open call for contributions and welcome your texts or creative contributions on any topic connected to wisdom that you would like to share with the Metis community. You can find more information about this and about today's podcast in the show notes below. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.